Constructivist learning theory, problem solving, and transfer. After studying this chapter, you will be able to explain the basic claims underlying constructivist learning theory and give examples of constructivist practices. Using the common types of problems, provide examples of how the five-step approach to problem solving might be used. Describe learning situations in which the different kinds of positive transfer would be supported. Explain how in online environments, especially those designed using the principles of gaming, support constructivist learning and problem solving. When you begin to teach, you may devote a substantial amount of class time to having students learn information discovered by others. But the acquisition of a storehouse of facts, concepts, and principles is only part of what constitutes an appropriate education. Students must also learn how to find, analyze, evaluate, and use what they need to know how to accomplish whatever goals they set for themselves. In other words, students need to learn how to be effective problem solvers, a process that is also referred to as critical thinking. One justification for teaching problem-solving skills, in addition to ensuring mastery of factual information, is that life in technologically oriented countries is marked by high-speed change. New products, services, and social conventions are rapidly introduced and integrated into our lives. Cell phones, cameras, and portable music players once required separate devices, but are now available in a single handheld device commonly called a smartphone. Anti-cancer treatments that are based on a person's genetic profile and in vitro fertilization are two other technological innovations that significantly affect the lives of many people. But change, particularly rapid change, can be a mixed blessing. Although new products and services can make life more convenient, efficient, and enjoyable, they can also make it more complicated and problematic. The Green Revolution promises new jobs but requires major changes in how companies earn profits and employees earn livings. Advances in medical care promise healthier and longer lives, but they introduce a host of moral, ethical, legal, and economic problems. The educational implication that flows from these observations is clear. If we are to benefit from our ability to produce rapid and sometimes dramatic change, our schools need to invest more time, money, and effort in teaching students how to be effective problem solvers. This emphasis on teaching problem-solving skills has been promoted by many people, including Tony Wagner, author of The Global Achievement Gap and Creating Innovators. Wagner has been a high school teacher and principal and is currently an innovation education fellow at Harvard University's Technology and Entrepreneurship Center, makes the following statement or argument. However, in the 21st century, mastery of the basic skills of reading, writing, and math is no longer enough. Almost any job that pays more than minimum wage, both blue and white collar, now calls for employees who know how to solve a range of intellectual and technical problems. Thus, work, learning, and citizenship in the 21st century demand that we all know how to think, to reason, analyze, weigh evidence, problem solve, and to communicate effectively. Wagner's argument is supported by interviews with many business executives who, because of changes in the way work is organized, point to the need for employees to have critical thinking and problem-solving skills. This means, among other things, knowing how to ask the right question and being able to engage in productive discussions to discover the needs of colleagues and customers, two topics we will cover in this chapter. Good problem solvers share two general characteristics: a well-organized, meaningful fund of knowledge and a systematic set of problem-solving skills. Historically, cognitive learning theories have been particularly useful sources of ideas for impacting or imparting both. In this chapter, then, we will examine the issue of meaningful learning from the perspective of a cognitive theory that we introduced previously in the book, Constructivism. We will then go on to describe the nature of the problem-solving process and what you can do to help your students become better problem solvers. After describing the circumstances under which learned capabilities are applied to new tasks, a process known as transfer of learning, we conclude the chapter by considering how technology can contribute to knowledge construction and problem solving. What's the problem? Celeste brings the lesson to a close. Then, as the bell rings and the students file out, she approaches Connie, who has observed the lesson. Celeste is clearly upset. I just cannot believe it. I cannot believe that those students ever got into the physics class. They don't know the math they need. They don't know basic concepts. They don't even seem to know the scientific method very well. I don't know who they had for science and math before, but whoever it was, they sure missed the boat. The students or the teachers? The boat, they both missed the both. She chuckles, takes a deep breath, and sits down next to Connie. I mean, they both missed the boat. Connie smiles. Celeste says, sorry about that, but that was a very simple problem that I gave them today, and they just couldn't get their heads around it. They had trouble even getting started. Okay, let's reflect on that, says Connie. You made some observations while you were teaching the lesson. You also made a few inferences, and you seemed to feel pretty strongly about those inferences. I observed that the students had difficulty working with the scenario you gave them, and I'm not so sure about your inferences. Connie pauses to make sure that Celeste is understood. I suppose there could have been another explanation for why they didn't do well with the problem, says Celeste. I'm sure there are prerequisites for them to get into the class, and I know from my own observations early in the year that there are very good students in this class, but if they had the right knowledge, then why couldn't they solve the problem? Maybe they didn't understand that there was a problem to solve, says Connie. To be honest, I wasn't sure why you presented this scenario. Perhaps your students thought you were presenting an example, and that's why they asked questions about concepts that they thought might be relevant. They were trying, but they just didn't know how to engage. After a pause, Connie continues, perhaps they were unable to solve the problem you had in mind because they were unable to identify a problem in the scenario. Before a problem can be solved, it must first be understood as a problem. Pause and reflect. Clearly, problem solving is a critical skill for students at all grade levels. When students have difficulties with problems, we often infer that they don't know how to solve the problem. In other words, we assume that problem solving is simply a matter of finding solutions. Not all problems are listed at the end of the chapter in the textbook, however. In many cases, the difficulties students experience with problems is not in finding the solution, but in finding the problem in the first place. What was your experience as a learner when math problems in a text were assigned as homework? What about problems that were not as well defined or well structured? How much you help your students engage in both problem finding and problem solving? Meaningful learning within a constructivist framework. Constructivism, as you may recall, holds that meaningful learning occurs when people actively try to make sense of the world, when they construct an interpretation of how and why things are, by filtering new ideas and experiences through existing knowledge structures, referred to in previous chapters as schemes. For example, an individual who lives in a country that provides for little or no cost such social services as medical care, counseling, education, job placement, and training, and several weeks of paid vacation a year is likely to have constructed a rather different view of the role of government in people's lives from that of someone who lives in a country with a more market-oriented economy. To put it another way, meaningful learning is the active creation of knowledge structures such as concepts, rules, hypotheses, and associations from personal experience. In this section, we'll take a brief look at an early constructivist-oriented approach to learning, examine the nature of the constructivist model, and then put it all in perspective by considering the limits as well as the advantages of the constructivist viewpoint. Jerome Bruner and Discovery Learning, an early constructivist perspective. Constructivist explanations of learning are not new. Over the past 75 years, they have been promoted by such notable scholars as John Dewey, Jean Piaget, Lev Vygotsky, and Jerome Bruner. One of Bruner's contributions from the 1960s was the concept of discovery learning. Bruner argued that too much school learning takes the form of step-by-step study of verbal or numerical statements or formulas that students can reproduce on cue but are unable to use outside the classroom. When students are presented with such highly structured materials as worksheets and other types of drill and practice exercises, Bruner argues they become too dependent on other people. Furthermore, they are likely to think of learning as something done only to earn a reward. Instead of using techniques that feature pre-selected and prearranged materials, Bruner believes teachers should confront children with problems and help them seek solutions either independently or by engaging in group discussion. True learning, says Bruner, involves figuring out how to use what you already know in order to go beyond what you already think. Like Piaget, Bruner argues that conceptions that children arrive at on their own are usually more meaningful than those proposed by others, and that students do not need to be rewarded when they seek to make sense of things that puzzle them. Bruner does not suggest that students should discover every fact or principle or formula they may need to know. Discovery is simply too inefficient a process to be used that widely, and learning from others can be as meaningful as personal discovery. Rather, Bruner argues that certain types of outcomes, understanding the ways in which ideas connect with one another, the possibility of solving problems on our own, and how what we already know is relevant to what we are trying to learn, are the essence of education and can best be achieved through personal discovery. Bruner's ideas about the role of discovery in learning are still widely accepted. Roger Schank, a prominent cognitive scientist, argues that students learn more through repeated exercise or repeated experience and discovery than through listening to others. Given the promise that discovery learning holds for improvements in meaningful learning, problem solving, and transfer, researchers have not been reluctant to test its effectiveness. Those efforts, which cover a span of about 45 years, have been intensely analyzed and provide solid support for Bruner's claims. These analyses show that leaving students entirely to their own devices does not work. When students have to read and understand materials on their own and work out their own solutions to a problem, they do less well on a test of material than students who receive direct, explicit instruction from the teacher, which could include explanations, worked problems, and feedback. By contrast, guided discovery produces better test scores than direct instruction. Guided discovery and its close relative, inquiry-based learning, means providing students with various forms of support, such as explaining some aspect of the material or task either to themselves or the teacher, providing prompts or suggestions about how to proceed, and providing feedback at critical points. Constructivism today. Constructivism is an umbrella term. It covers several views of learning that share common claims. After a brief examination of the claims that unite the various views of learning under the classification of constructivism, we will describe three variations of constructivist learning theory and look at the conditions that foster constructivist learning. Common claims that frame constructivism. Four key ideas provide a constructivist frame through which we can view learning and learners: prior knowledge, multiple perspectives, self-regulation, and authentic learning. We will briefly describe the claim that captures each idea. Meaningful learning is the active creation of knowledge structures from personal experience. Constructivists view the learner as an active agent in the construction of knowledge. Each learner builds a personal view of the world by using existing knowledge, interests, attitudes, goals, and the like to select and interpret the information she encounters. This assumption highlights the importance of what educational psychologists call prior knowledge, the previously learned knowledge and skill that students bring to the classroom. A Harvard University professor of physics discovered this for himself after spending years lecturing to students and being disappointed in their failure to correctly answer conceptual questions and solve problems. He concluded that he needed to teach in a way that help students connect new concepts to pre-existing knowledge and construct mental models of how science works. He did this by devoting class time to discussions, peer interaction, and the use of conceptual questions. This technique, which is now referred to as a flipped classroom, is described in more detail later in this chapter. Social interaction and the negotiation of understanding with others can help learners construct knowledge. One person's knowledge can never be identical to another person's because knowledge is the result of a personal interpretation of experience, which is influenced by such factors as the learner's age, gender, race, ethnic background, and knowledge base. By interacting with others, learners have the opportunity to gain a perspective different from their own. Thus, the additions to, depletions from, or modifications of individuals' knowledge structures result from the sharing of multiple perspectives. Systematic, open-minded discussions and debates are instrumental in helping individuals create personal views. Engaging with others helps learners develop their own views, but does not guarantee that those views will match the views of others. There are many instances in which people cannot reconcile their views and so agree to disagree. For example, in January 2002, President George Bush signed into law the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, more popularly known as No Child Left Behind. Although everyone agrees on what the law requires, for instance, all children in grades 3 through 8 scoring at the proficient level or above on tests of math and reading language arts by 2014, with negative consequences for schools and districts that fail to show progress toward these goals, there's a sharp disagreement about the true purpose of this legislation and its likely effects on students and teachers. Some see it as an effective means of school reform, whereas others see it as an attempt to undercut the autonomy and efficacy of public education. In matters such as these, truth is where it always is for the constructivist, in the mind of the beholder. Self-regulation by learners is a key to successful learning. Self-regulated learning, as you will recall from the previous chapter, occurs when a person generates and controls thoughts, feelings, and actions in an effort to achieve a learning goal. If you reflect on the discussions of the self-regulated learning in the previous chapter, and keep in mind the first two claims above, this third claim of constructivists should come as no surprise. Constructivists view learners not as passive recipients of new information, but as active agents who use their prior knowledge and experiences to engage their environments, including other people, to enhance their existing knowledge structures, Piaget's concept of assimilation, and to build new knowledge structures. In other words, or for example, accommodation. Self-regulation skills allow learners to take charge, to function as the agents of their own learning rather than objects of instruction. Research is a form of learning that requires highly developed self-regulation skills. Scholars use their prior knowledge to decide what questions need to be asked next and how to go about answering those questions. As we have seen in previous chapters, scholars form and reform their positions on aspects of theory or research as a result of years of discussion and debate with colleagues who bring multiple perspectives and experiences to the issues at hand. The debate between Piagetians and the Vygotskians, discussed in Chapter 2 on stage theories of development, is a good example of how constructivist learning works. Authentic problems provide realistic contexts that contribute to the construction and transfer of knowledge. When students encounter problems that are realistic, they are able to use what they already know about the problem situation. For example, imagine that a middle school class in Juneau, Alaska, needs to learn how to use mathematical formulas to make predictions. They need to understand what variables are, how some variables can be used or combined to predict other variables, and what to do with the values of predictor variables to make their predictions. One way to approach the task would be to memorize the formulas, plug in values that are provided on a test or in a problem workbook, generate their predictions, and find out if their predictions match the correct answers. Another way to approach the task would be to pose the question, what might happen to the economy of Juneau as the nearby Mendenhall Glacier, which is a major tourist attraction near Juneau, shrinks? Such a question provides rich opportunities for students to identify and work with variables related to the glacier's ecology and the town's tourism industry. Number of tourist visits to the glacier, jobs supported by tourism, hotel bookings, cruise ship fees, customers at restaurants and shops, and tax dollars. Students' research questions might include, how do we find out that information? How do the variables influence the economies? How do we measure the influence? In addition to allowing students to engage their prior knowledge, authentic tasks also provide opportunities for learners to work collaboratively, thus providing opportunities for social interaction and the negotiation of meaning through multiple perspectives. Taken together, the constructivist claims above provide a frame for understanding meaningful learning as the construction of knowledge. When we look through the constructivist frame, our view is directed toward the key concepts of prior knowledge, multiple perspectives, self-regulation, and authentic learning. As mentioned earlier, however, constructivist theory has several variations. We can think of these variations as lenses that can be placed in the frame. The frame keeps our attention directed toward the common constructivist claims and the key concepts they represent. But each lens changes slightly how we focus among the key concepts. One lens, for example, brings prior knowledge into relief. Another places the multiple perspectives of social interaction in the foreground. Each lens represents a variation on the constructivist theme. We look briefly through the three lenses: cognitive, social, and critical constructivism.